Mr Deputy Speaker.
Ms Finlay, member for those.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise this afternoon to make my contributions on the motion before us and to express the seriousness of what is before this House. It is clear from the contributions made, not only from this side of the House but also from the crossbench, that this Parliament determines that the lack of action by this minister to adhere to an order of the House requires assessment from the Privileges Committee. We know that despite the weak positioning of the government in response to this motion today, that this minister had ample opportunity, ample time and ample access to the information to adhere to the order of this House. This government have said repeatedly today that it was not appropriate, it could be unlawful, that it might cause sovereign risk, that it would put at risk negotiations of this government, and each and every one of those points is adamantly untrue. This government think that they can stand and say whatever they like in their own defence, knowing it not to be true and expecting that this Parliament will accept that. Well, it has been said today already, and it will be said again, that this Parliament no longer accept and actually have the power to require this government to do the right thing, to be honest and act in the best interests of Tasmanians. This minister was ordered by this place to provide cost estimates of 3 projects: the Marinus project, the Northwest development, the transmission lines and the Battery of the Nation. He was required to simply do something that he would have had access to, and the people that advise him would have had access to, because not that long prior, details were in the budget papers. And we know that despite not responding to an order of the House, in that moment, backgrounding was happening to the media, and has been said already today, but it is important to put on record that what that shows is this minister has no regard for the authorities or respect of this place and can actively and intentionally undermine the authorities and respect of this place by backgrounding media instead of responding to orders of this House. Now, when we hear from this side, the minister himself, the Attorney-General, the Premier of Tasmania commending this minister for that action, once this has gone to Privileges and the Privileges Committee have determined this position, and if they find that this minister is in contempt of that order, then each of those people that have spoken to commend this minister should reflect on their own performance. We heard today from members of this government, when we raised this motion for consideration of the House, comments like, "Can you imagine? What's the point?" Said in that sort of a tone. It's ridiculous. It's not terrible behaviour. I ask the attorney of this government, the person who is the first officer of this state, if she actually believes that the bar of standards in this place is set so low that to do the right thing and act in the best interest of Tasmania is ridiculous. Because to me, I am offended by that position of this government, and I believe that the people of Tasmania would equally be offended by such a low position and a commitment to such poor standards and behaviour. One of the things that I know that not only individuals in Tasmania but businesses, small and large, are starting to ask and see the realities of this government is that it's really hard to trust anything that they say or do. Yeah. And this is a demonstration of how we cannot trust this government in what they say or do. And it is time, and now the Parliament has the power to ensure there are consequences for this poor behaviour. Because it's not just the order, as we are debating this afternoon, that this minister has flagrantly disregarded, but it is repeatedly through question time, through other instruments of this Parliament, that this minister and others flatly refuse to answer simple and complex, but equally and both important questions. Just today in question time, again, simple questions, yes or no questions, not responded to, or in fact given misleading or untruthful responses. And it's never been acceptable, but it's no longer acceptable. And now the Parliament has the power to call this government and minister to account. There's been a suggestion that our order was one done with too much time for the minister to respond. Well, for the people that are listening to this or reading back on Hansard, it's important to put on the record that this motion was tabled at 11 a.m. the day before the motion was considered, and not considered until about 5 p.m. the afternoon of the day after. So not only is that just over 24 hours, it's 30 hours of effort that could be applied to the responding to the order. And so there's much said about how, he didn't have the time to do it. This minister has 4 years been the Minister for Energy and presided over these projects. This minister has been in deep negotiations and discussions with entities, with organisations and with other levels of government on this project. For him to tell this Parliament that he didn't have access to that information is categorically untrue, and we all know that because of the backgrounding to the media and because of the access to the information that was in the budget papers, and because he is the minister that's been across these projects for years and years. We've come to expect that this minister thinks he can get up and say whatever he wants, but now he is on notice. This is the first step, and there will be many more if he continues his behaviour of ensuring that we call this minister to account. As evidence on why our being the Parliament, not our being Labor, calls for this information, which was cost estimates on these 3 projects, and how it wasn't out of order. It in fact was determined by the Parliament to be in order, but it's not dissimilar to other activities that have occurred not just this year and in previous recent years, but across the full term of this government. Throughout the term of this government, when tenders are being called for, this government have on record that at the same time, while these processes are active, they provide cost estimates for projects. We didn't ask for commercial in confidence documentation. We didn't ask for tender documentation. We asked for cost estimates. Cost estimates could have been provided and they weren't by this minister. Just like when the Rosebery Police Station, there was an estimated $1 million upgrade at the time that they were calling for tenders. When tenders were called for Launceston General Hospital Children's Ward, there were cost estimates, $9.8 million, for that project on record. Like the tenders for the East Derwent highway safety improvements, cost estimates provided, $2.8 million from this project. Cost estimates for the Burnie ambulance station, for other ambulance stations across the state in Bridgewater, Oatlands and Queenstown, and cost estimates in tenders for the Justice Connect program and for the Mersey Community Hospital redevelopment, for the redevelopment of the Hobart Airport flyover. Across the full term of this government, across a number of portfolio areas, this government in live tender processes publish cost estimates. It is a simple question, a question this minister, we know absolutely could have answered, but chose intentionally not to, disregarded the requirements of the House and set up a distracting level of conversation to try and save himself from having to do it. Now, that's not acceptable. It's not acceptable to anyone in any place in the community, and it's definitely not acceptable of a Minister of the Crown in the Tasmanian Parliament. Now, I am fairly new to this place. I haven't come across this type of motion before where we've got to this point of discussions in the Parliament, and so I did some research on how valid our motion is, and I satisfied myself that this motion and this action is valid. What we are questioning is the actions of this minister, and we're referring him to the Privileges Committee for that committee to determine and make an outcome. That is the everyday processes of this Parliament that are well documented and understood because they've been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. This government, this minister, know the consequences of such poor behaviour and disregard for this Parliament, but thought he could always get away with it. But what we need to also reflect on is, and Deputy Speaker, I'd like to acknowledge your contribution just prior to now, a strong contribution in the Parliament. We find ourselves in this situation because 2 members of this government left the government and joined the crossbenchers. The government is now in minority government and it needs to work across the Parliament. It has not yet understood how to do that, and it has not yet amended its poor behaviours to ensure ensure that it can work in the best interests of Tasmania. And so what we find is that the very reasons why these members left the government and went to the crossbench was because of concerns around the costs and the cost implications for Tasmanians for these very projects, for the Marinus project, for the North West transmission lines and for the Battery of the Nation. Now, you would think this signal, which from media reports I understand these expressions of concern were provided to this government as early as March this year, and then with the actions of these members leaving the government to the crossbench, that this government would actually go, okay, right, the rules of engagement here have changed and we need to stand up and be more particular about the way we deal with these projects in the public but also in the Parliament. But they are yet to actually do that, and they find themselves in this situation this afternoon. There are powers within this House. It's clearly stated within the standing orders. We speak in and sign oaths when we are appointed to this Parliament. We commit to the orders of this place. We commit to being honest. We commit to being trustworthy. We commit to acting in the best interests of Tasmanians. And on every measure in this Parliament, this minister has not done that in this occasion and many others, and in the future will continue to be called to account. And it is appropriate and essential that this Parliament send this minister to Privileges Committee for this to be determined, to ensure that there is some integrity of the way that the standards operate in this place in the Parliament of Tasmania.
Ms Butler, member for Lyme.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak to this notice of motion. And geez, haven't you, on the other side of the room, had a terrible week? An absolutely terrible week. And actually, haven't you had a terrible